There's something interesting about the stories we tell ourselves. They don't usually feel like stories. They feel like facts. They feel solid, grounded, logical, almost proven. And when something happens that resembles something from your past, the story doesn't slowly build. It arrives fully formed. It's already there. It doesn't feel like you're choosing it. It feels like you're recognizing something that's always been true. Like, this always happens to me. People don't really stay. I'm too much. I'm not enough. I have to handle things alone. I can't rely on anyone. And what makes that thought so powerful isn't just the wording, it's the familiarity underneath it. The body recognizes it. The nervous system relaxes into it in a strange way, even if it hurts, because it knows this terrain. It has walked this path before, and the brain prefers familiar ground over unknown territory, even when the familiar ground is painful. That's something most people underestimate. Familiar does not mean healthy. Familiar does not mean aligned. Familiar just means repeated. Your brain is a prediction machine. It constantly tries to anticipate what will happen next, based on what has happened before. And it does that not by asking whether something is good for you, but by asking whether it's known. If a certain emotional pattern has repeated enough times, the brain begins to expect it. And when it expects it, it prepares for it. And when it prepares for it, it subtly helps recreate it. That's how patterns begin to feel inevitable. But they are not inevitable. They are reinforced. Every time a similar situation happens and the same interpretation follows, a neural pathway strengthens. Not dramatically, not with fireworks. Very quietly. Neurons that fire together wire together. And the more often they fire together, the more automatic the pairing becomes. So a situation always leads to interpretation. A trigger always leads to a story. And an emotion always leads to identity. After enough repetition, the brain stops distinguishing between interpretation and truth. It becomes default. And once something becomes default, it no longer feels optional. It feels like who you are. And that's when you start to think these unserving thoughts like, this is just how I am. I'm just someone who I've always been this way. But that identity was built from repetition, not from destiny, not from essence, from repetition. And repetition can build something else too. The reason the story feels so true is not because it's universally accurate. It's because it has been rehearsed so often that the nervous system no longer questions it. It has been emotionally encoded. Think about it this way. If a child grows up hearing a certain tone, feeling a certain atmosphere, interpreting certain behaviors in a particular way, that interpretation becomes normal. It becomes the lens through which future experiences are filtered. And then one day, as an adult, something mildly similar happens. A delayed message, a change in tone, a boundary, and suddenly the old lens activates. The story floods in. Oh, they're pulling away, you think. I did something wrong. I'm about to be left. The intensity of the reaction isn't about the current moment. It's about the accumulated history attached to it. That's why the story feels so convincing. It's layered. It has years of emotional reinforcement behind it. And because the brain prefers coherence, it will always choose the interpretation that fits its existing wiring, even if another interpretation is equally possible. This is where people often get discouraged. They say, oh, but I know this isn't true. And yet, it still feels true. And that makes them doubt themselves even more. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. Feeling true usually just means well practiced. The brain loves efficiency. It wants to conserve energy. So it automates what it repeats. If you have interpreted situations through the same lens for years, that lens becomes your shortcut. Shortcut thinking is powerful. It saves time, but it also locks in identity. And identity shapes perception. And perception shapes experience. Now here's where this becomes empowering rather than overwhelming. If repetition built the old pattern, repetition can build a new one. Hear this again. If repetition built the old pattern, repetition can build a new one. This is not about denying reality. It's not about pretending something painful didn't happen. It's about recognizing that interpretation is not fixed. If you consciously choose a different thought and repeat it consistently, you begin building a parallel pathway. At first, it will feel unnatural. That's important. The unfamiliar always feels unstable at the beginning. The nervous system might resist it. You might hear an inner voice saying, "This isn't true," or "You're just lying to yourself." But what's actually happening is that the brain hasn't wired this pathway strongly yet. The old story has thousands of repetitions behind it. The new one has 5. Of course, the old one feels louder, but repetition changes that. If you choose a thought that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you have been, and you return to it daily, especially in moments when the old story would normally activate, something shifts. Not because you convinced yourself logically, but because the brain responds to frequency. What you think repeatedly becomes easier to think. What becomes easier to think becomes more believable. And what becomes believable begins to feel like you. There's research in neuroplasticity showing that focused repetition over approximately 10 days can begin creating measurable changes in neural pathways. Not complete transformation and not total rewiring, but the beginning of a shift. 10 days of consistent repetition can make a new thought feel less foreign. 30 days can make it feel accessible. 90 days can make it feel normal. And once something feels normal, it stops feeling like effort. That's the point where identity begins to upgrade. Because identity isn't a declaration. It's a pattern of repeated internal agreement. If you repeatedly agree with a new interpretation, if you reinforce it daily, if you choose it consciously, even when it feels slightly unstable, you begin installing it. And installation leads to embodiment. And embodiment changes behavior without forcing it. You start responding differently, not because you're trying harder, but because the lens has shifted. You interpret a delayed message differently. You interpret silence differently. You interpret a boundary differently. And because interpretation changes, reaction changes. And because reaction changes, experience changes. This is not mystical, it's neurological. The familiar becomes unfamiliar. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. And the old story begins to lose its grip, not because you fought it, but because you stopped feeding it repetition. You didn't destroy it, you starved it. That's important. You don't need to attack the old pattern, you don't need to analyze it endlessly. You don't need to prove it wrong. You need to reduce its reinforcement and increase reinforcement elsewhere. That's how patterns unlearn. And when patterns unlearn, identity shifts. And when identity shifts, the world mirrors something different back. Not because the world changed overnight, but because your perception filtered differently. If you no longer identify as someone who's always left, you stop scanning for signs of abandonment. You stop bracing for impact. You stop reacting preemptively. And that changes relational dynamics. If you no longer identify as someone who is not chosen, you stop subtly withdrawing or overcompensating. And that changes outcomes. Reality often mirrors internal agreement. So if something feels deeply convincing right now, that doesn't mean it's permanent. It means it's practiced. And what has been practiced can be practiced differently. You are not stuck because something is inherently wrong with you. You're stuck because a pattern has been repeated long enough to feel like you. And you can repeat something else, not once, not in a burst of motivation, but consistently. And over time, the story that once felt undeniable begins to feel optional. And the new story that once felt fragile begins to feel solid. That's how identity upgrades. And once identity upgrades, everything reorganizes around it. If something feels deeply convincing right now, that doesn't mean it's permanent. It means it's practiced. And what has been practiced can be practiced differently. You're not stuck because something is inherently wrong with you. You're stuck because something has been repeated long enough to feel like you. And repetition built it. So repetition can build something else, not by force, not by pretending, but by choosing differently often enough, that the new thought no longer feels foreign. At some point, it stops feeling like effort. It starts feeling natural. And when something feels natural, you stop questioning it. That's the shift. Not a dramatic breakthrough, just a different internal agreement. And once you agree differently with yourself, your reactions change. And once your reactions change, your experience changes. Not because you forced life to move, but because you stopped rehearsing the old story.